If you grew up in the 80s or 90s, or if you ever had any contact with Jehovah's Witnesses, you almost certainly remember it. A book with a dark red cover, heavy in the hands and even heavier on the mind. The title left no room for doubt. Revelation, its Grand Climax at Hand. Published in 1988, distributed in dozens of languages, obsessively studied by millions of people around the world. This was not just another religious book. It was a psychological weapon, a manual designed to hijack the most primitive human fear, the fear of the end of everything. For over a decade, this book was the centerpiece of Watchtower education. It sat on every Kingdom Hall shelf. It was carried in every field service bag. It was opened on every coffee table during home Bible studies. Entire families organized their spiritual lives around its pages, believing that within those chapters lay the roadmap to surviving the greatest catastrophe in human history. Not reading it was not an option. Not believing it was unthinkable. Today, decades later, this book has virtually disappeared from the official life of Jehovah's Witnesses. The leadership no longer mentions it, no longer reprints it, no longer studies it in the Kingdom Halls. It is as though it never existed. But here is the truth they do not want you to discover. The book may have been discarded, but the damage it caused was never repaired. The mental scars it left on millions of people remain open, and the same tactics of terror it taught are still being used today, in a different packaging. In this video, we are going to open this red book page by page. We are going to expose how it was built to manipulate, how it distorted ancient biblical texts to feed an illusion of grandeur, and how the Watchtower turned the apocalypse into a commercial product, sold with the most valuable currency in existence, human fear. Part 1. The Visual Terror Machine. To understand the power this book wielded, you need to understand how it was consumed. The Revelation book was not optional reading. It was mandatory study material, conducted in Kingdom Halls during weekly sessions that stretched on for years. Members read paragraph by paragraph, answered pre-formulated questions, and returned to the same book over and over again. Some congregations studied this work 3-4 times over the years. Each time, the same pages, the same images, the same fear, reinforced layer upon layer until it became part of the way those people processed reality. The repetition was not accidental. It was the method. And the method worked because of a very calculated editorial decision: the illustrations. The book was filled with images that seemed ripped from a medieval nightmare. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse riding over entire nations, bringing famine, plague, and death on a global scale. 7-headed monsters emerging from the sea, representing demonic governments and empires. Angels pouring bowls of wrath upon humanity. And one of the most disturbing images of all: ordinary people, men, women, entire families, being crushed like grapes in a giant winepress, blood flowing while God executed his final judgment. These illustrations were not decorative. They were deliberately traumatic. Children of 5, 6, 7 years old sat in Kingdom Halls with this book open on their laps, absorbing these scenes of mass destruction while their parents nodded alongside them. For a child still forming their understanding of the world, those images were not theological metaphors. They were real. The 7-headed monster existed. The destruction was coming. And if you did not obey, if you did not do everything the organization commanded, that blood in the winepress would be yours. These children did not have nightmares about fictional monsters under the bed. They had nightmares about Armageddon, about fire falling from the sky, about the ground splitting open beneath their feet, because a book published by a religious organization told them it was going to happen in their lifetime. This is the oldest mechanism of religious control in existence, linking obedience to survival. Obey or die, preach or die, donate or die. But the Watchtower did something that elevated this tactic to an industrial level. They did not simply preach fear from the platform. They printed fear on glossy paper, illustrated it in vivid colors, and placed it in the hands of every member to be studied weekly until the terror became a permanent part of how those people saw the world. Other religious groups warned about hell in sermons that faded from memory by Monday morning. The Watchtower put hell on your kitchen table and told you to study it every Tuesday night for the next 10 years. Part 2. The Illusion of Grandeur. If visual terror was the engine of the book, the true engineering of manipulation lay in the prophetic interpretation. And this is where the Revelation book becomes truly disturbing, not for what it showed, but for what it claimed. The book of Revelation, written nearly 2,000 years ago, is a text filled with symbolism, visions, and mystical language that theologians, historians, and scholars still debate today. Entire academic careers have been built on attempting to decode its meaning. Libraries hold thousands of volumes offering competing interpretations. It is one of the most complex and contested pieces of religious literature ever written. The Watchtower, however, debated nothing. They declared with absolute certainty that they knew exactly what every symbol meant. And remarkably, almost every prophecy pointed to themselves. The most notorious example is the 7 trumpets of Revelation. In the biblical text, 7 angels sound trumpets that unleash plagues and cosmic judgments upon the earth. These are passages loaded with gravity and mystery. The Watchtower's interpretation? The 7 trumpets were actually 7 conventions of Jehovah's Witnesses held in the United States between 1922 and 1928. Resolutions read at assemblies in the American Midwest were presented as the literal fulfillment of celestial prophecies written in the 1st century. Think about the magnitude of that claim. Events that the rest of the world did not even register, that made no headlines in any major newspaper of the time, that no historian outside the organization has ever considered significant, were elevated to the status of prophetic milestones in God's divine plan for humanity. A few hundred people in folding chairs listening to organizational resolutions in Ohio were, according to this book, the fulfillment of angelic trumpets that shook the heavens. And it did not stop there. The plague of locusts described in Revelation chapter 9, one of the most enigmatic visions in all of Scripture, was interpreted as the members of the organization themselves. The locusts that tormented men were Jehovah's Witnesses going door to door, bothering the world with their preaching. The leadership literally took a prophecy about terrifying creatures and told their followers, "That is you. You are the instrument of divine judgment." Your Saturday morning door knocking is a cosmic event foretold in the Bible nearly 2,000 years ago. To someone on the outside, this sounds absurd. But you need to understand the effect this narrative had inside the system. If you are a devoted Jehovah's Witness, studying this book week after week, you are not reading an eccentric interpretation. You are receiving divine confirmation that your life has cosmic purpose. You are not just an ordinary citizen going to work and paying bills. You are a soldier in a spiritual war. Every door you knock on is a prophetic act. Every rejection you suffer in the preaching work is part of a battle between good and evil. And the only organization on the planet that understands this, the only one that can guide you safely through the apocalypse, is the Watchtower. This illusion of grandeur was the glue that held everything together. Without it, fear alone would have faded over time. But fear combined with an inflated sense of cosmic purpose creates something far more powerful. It creates identity. You do not obey simply because you are afraid of dying. You obey because you believe you are part of the greatest mission that has ever existed in the history of humanity. Walk away from the organization, and you do not just lose a community. You lose your role in the most important story ever told. That is what made leaving so devastating, and that is exactly what the book was designed to achieve. Part 3. The Wall Between Two Worlds. With visual terror firmly installed and cosmic identity constructed, the Revelation book took the 3rd step in its engineering of control, the total demonization of the outside world. The book did not merely say that Armageddon was coming. It mapped out who would be destroyed and why. The United Nations was presented as the Scarlet Beast, an instrument of Satan disguised as a peace organization. The governments of the world were heads of the apocalyptic monster. Other religions, all of them without exception, formed Babylon the Great, the prostitute riding the beast, drunk on the blood of the saints. Catholicism, Protestantism, Islam, Buddhism, all were part of a single demonic system destined for total destruction. There were no neutral parties. There was no middle ground. You were either inside the organization and safe, or outside and condemned. And here is the practical effect of that demonization. It severed every emotional bridge between the members and the outside world. If your Catholic neighbor is part of Babylon, he is not really your neighbor. He is a victim of Satan's system who will soon be destroyed. If the government that protects your rights is ahead of the beast, you owe it no real loyalty. If the United Nations tries to promote peace, that is merely a satanic illusion to divert people from the truth. Even humanitarian organizations, charities, and social movements working to reduce suffering in the world were viewed with suspicion, because improving this system was seen as polishing the furniture on a sinking ship. This absolute separation between us and them had a devastating consequence for human empathy. The suffering of people outside the organization was minimized, sometimes even justified. Natural disasters, wars, famine. None of this was seen as human tragedy demanding compassion, but as confirming signs that the world system was collapsing exactly as predicted. The worse the world got, the more validated the organization felt. The suffering of others became fuel for the internal sense of urgency. A tsunami killing hundreds of thousands of people was not a moment for grief. It was a talking point for field service the following Saturday. This mentality created a profound emotional isolation. Members maintained superficial relationships with coworkers, neighbors, and even non-witness family members, not because they were bad people, but because the book they studied every week taught them, with vivid images and categorical prophetic interpretations, that those people were condemned. Investing emotionally in someone marked for destruction was not only pointless, it was spiritually dangerous. Forming deep bonds with people outside the organization meant risking your own loyalty, your own faith, and ultimately your own survival at Armageddon. The silent disposal. But time is the mortal enemy of any prophecy with an expiration date. And the Revelation book had many. The generation of 1914, the one that was supposedly not going to pass away before the end came, passed away. The people who were adults in 1914 grew old, fell ill, and died. One by one, decade after decade. And the end did not come. The prophetic connections that seemed so solid in the 80s and 90s, the links between biblical events and American conventions of the 1920s, became harder and harder to defend as new members asked questions and outside researchers exposed the inconsistencies. The internet made it impossible to hide the failures. Former members began documenting every broken promise, every shifted date, every prophecy that quietly evaporated. And then, silently, the leadership began to retreat. There was no formal announcement. There was no public retraction. There was no apology to the millions of people who had lived decades in panic because of those pages. The book simply stopped being mentioned. The studies ended. The references vanished from the most recent publications. The organization invoked what it calls new light, the concept that spiritual understanding is progressive and that God reveals truths gradually. In practice, new light means that everything they stated with absolute certainty yesterday can be discarded today without anyone having to take responsibility for the damage caused. It is a theological escape hatch that allows the leadership to be perpetually wrong without ever being held accountable. Think about what that means for the people who built their lives around those teachings. Families who refused to plan for retirement because Armageddon was coming before they would need it. Young people who skipped college because the system was about to collapse. Parents who raised their children in a state of constant existential anxiety because a book told them the end was imminent. None of those people received an apology. None of them received an explanation. They were simply expected to accept the new light and move on, as if decades of psychological damage could be erased by a doctrinal update in a magazine article. The Revelation book became a ghost within the very organization that created it. Younger members barely know it exists. Older members prefer not to talk about it. And the leadership acts as though those decades of printed terror never happened. The fear that never left. But here is what the leadership cannot erase: the mental conditioning that book installed in millions of people. And that is why this story matters today, right now, while you are watching this video. When a war breaks out in Europe, when missiles streak across the skies of the Middle East, when an earthquake devastates a city, something happens inside the minds of active Jehovah's Witnesses and even former members who left years ago. A trigger fires. An inner voice whispers, "What if they were right? What if this really is the end?" That trigger is not rational. It is emotional, deep, installed by years of repeated exposure to those images and those interpretations. It is a conditioned reflex, as automatic as blinking when something approaches your eyes. Some former members describe it as a scar that never fully heals. They left the organization 5, 10, 20 years ago. They rebuilt their lives. They found new communities, new careers, new reasons to live. But when the news broadcasts show explosions, when political leaders threaten war, when the world feels unstable, that old programming activates. For a brief, involuntary moment, they are sitting in a kingdom hall again, with the red book on their lap, staring at the wine press, feeling the weight of a destruction they were told was always just around the corner. And the current leadership knows this. They no longer need to publish a red book with illustrations of destruction. The heavy lifting has already been done. Now, all they need to do is turn on the camera, point to the news broadcasts, and say in a grave voice, World events confirm that we are in the last days. Stay firm, stay faithful, keep obeying the governing body. The message is the same as in 1988. Only the packaging has changed. The end of the world has become a permanent product of the Watchtower. It does not matter that every date has failed. It does not matter that every generation has passed. The product renews itself because it feeds on something that never ends. The news cycle. There will always be a war. There will always be a disaster. There will always be a crisis. And as long as there is fear in the world, the Watchtower will have the raw material to keep its members obedient. If you are watching this video and you were once a Jehovah's Witness, or you still are, I want you to understand something essential. That red book conditioned you to associate every world crisis with obedience to an organization. But the problem was never the Bible. The problem is what they did with the Bible. Because yes, the world is going through difficult times. The wars are real. The disasters are real. Global instability is real. Closing your eyes and pretending everything is fine would be just as dangerous as living paralyzed by fear. The Bible itself speaks of these times. It describes signs, upheavals, moments of judgment. That is not an invention of the Watchtower. It is written in the scriptures, in black and white, and has been for centuries. What the Watchtower did was take those texts and twist them to serve its own interests. It turned universal prophecies into tools of organizational control. It replaced the personal relationship with God with submission to a committee of men. It took the message of the book of Revelation, a message of hope for those who seek truth, and transformed it into an instrument of fear to keep people captive. You do not need an organization to read the Bible. You do not need a governing body to understand what the scriptures say about the times we are living in. The world is changing, crises are intensifying, and yes, that has biblical meaning. But that meaning does not lock you inside a kingdom hall. It sets you free to seek truth for yourself, directly in the scriptures, without human filters, without manipulation, and without any man on earth telling you that your salvation depends on your obedience to him. The fear you feel when watching the news is not proof that you need to return to an organization. It is proof that you need to open your Bible, read what is actually written, and build your own understanding of what God expects of you, freely, with dignity, and without chains. If this deep dive into the hidden history of the Watchtower opened your eyes, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you do not miss our upcoming investigations. Leave your comment below. Do you remember this red book? Did it mark your childhood? Do you still feel that trigger of fear when you watch the news? Your story matters, and it could help someone who is still trapped inside. See you in the next video.